Well, let's open our Bibles this evening to Numbers chapter 32 as we are continuing our walk through this wonderful book. We looked at chapter 30 last week, and we closed with that, and we looked at the vows of how God sees us in making promises and the vengeance of the Lord, and then the victory that he brings to those who will obey him. Tonight we want to look at 3 chapters that'll get us pretty close to the end of this 4th book of the Bible. It'll also give us 150 chapters done. So if you've been with us for a while, hopefully there's 150 chapters banked in your heart, so to speak. But we will finish the book of Numbers next week. We are still in the second generation of those who came out of Egypt, headed for the land of promise. You remember that their parents, 40 years earlier, really didn't agree with God or believe God enough to obey him. And even though they had experienced, the plagues in Egypt and the deliverance through the wilderness and almost a year sitting at Mount Sinai, when the time came to put their faith into action, they balked. And the Lord's judgment was that this generation that was over 20 years old would die in the wilderness, and they did. And so this is a new generation. And really we've come to the end of an era, if you will. Aaron has died. Miriam, his sister, has died. Aaron's son Eleazar has come to be the high priest. Moses, in chapter 31, fought his last battle and will soon in that same year be headed home to the Lord. And Joshua will step up and begin leading God's people into the land of promise. He really is an answer to Moses' prayer there in Numbers 27, where he prayed, Lord, give them a leader. Give them someone that they can listen to and follow. So we went with Moses last time on his final battle to avenge the people from the Midianites who had planned with Balaam, that false prophet, on how they could stumble God's people. And they had sent in their daughters who had invited the boys to come and worship at their altars of perversion. And the Lord did judge. 24,000 people died. But in the battle last week, 12,000 men went forth to fight, 1,000 from each tribe. They were led by a worship leader who had in his hands the things that would determine the will of God for the people in the battle. And they overthrew this idolatrous nation without losing one of their own men. It was a miracle. And so, with this victory in hand, the eastern side of the Jordan River, that side that's away from the Mediterranean Sea, now is firmly in the hands of the Jews. And the people and the people groups from the south all the way up to the Golan Heights have been overthrown. The children of Israel are kind of in the middle of that span. They're next to Jericho. But the message tonight from our chapters as the Lord is preparing to take his people in, and I think I've told you more than once that Deuteronomy is only a 30-day time period. It is one long month of classes with Moses rehearsing what's taken place. So they are very close to moving forward. And tonight's chapter is pretty interesting, and I think there's a lot to learn, but the main lesson is this. You should probably not hold out for anything less than everything God has. Or don't settle for anything less than everything God has promised. And certainly, if we fail to grab hold of and possess all that God makes available, it's really not his fault, it's ours, right? It isn't like he hasn't made it available. If you leave too much on the table as a Christian, you're gonna suffer lack. But God, you can't really put it at his feet. He's willing to do far more than we are ever willing to allow him to do. So I would entitle these chapters tonight, Go for All God Has for You. The book of Numbers is named after the census that was taken twice. First in the first chapter, the generation that didn't make it. And then in chapter 26, the second generation that would. God is interested in numbers. And we learn some lessons from them, but even more importantly, he cares about people. And he cares about you and I, and he wants your life to count for something. I mean, there's only so many years that you can put effort into the kingdom. You can spend a lot of time doing a lot of things well, but what will last? It'll be those things that you do in serving the Lord. And he wants you to be numbered among the ranks of those he used, not amongst the ranks of those that didn't make it, that failed. It had been a long time for Israel in doing anything good. In fact, if you begin reading, there's a whole generation that is lost. And by the time in Numbers you start reading in chapter 21 that the people are actually praying, you're thinking to yourself, oh man, look at them now. Finally, they're praying. There's been a lot of delayed gratification, if you will. It's an important concept when you raise kids, right? Kids want everything right now, but this nation has spent a generation of lives disappointed and disillusioned and disorganized and dysfunctional, and all because of the delay on their part to do what God wanted. He was willing, they were not. So this is the second generation. It's a new count from chapter 26. There's a new hope, and they've been winning battles because they've been willing to trust the Lord with their life. There's been a difference. This is a different generation. So by the time we get to chapter 32, and Moses begins to hear that some of the people are unwilling to go in. You can just imagine what this poor man at 120 years is going through. He's got flashbacks, and not the good variety. He just looks back to 40 years ago and goes, oh no, not again. We get so close, and that same horrible feeling starts to twist in his stomach as it was when those 10 spies came back and they turned an entire nation away from God's best. 10 guys talked 2.5 million people into not going in that direction. The influence that they had. Verse 1 tells us, chapter 32, that the children of Reuben and the children of Gad had a very great multitude of livestock. And when they saw the land of Jazer and the land of Gilead, and indeed the region was a place for livestock, the children of Gad and the children of Reuben came to speak to Moses and to Eleazar the priest and to the leaders of the congregation, and they said, hard name, hard name, hard name, hard name, hard name, hard. There's a bunch of hard names there. The countries which the Lord defeated before the congregation of Israel is a land for livestock, and your servant has livestock. Therefore, if we found favor in your sight, let this land be given to your servants as a possession. Do not take us over the Jordan. Like I said, the children of Israel were encamped on the eastern side of the Jordan near Jericho, making final preparations to finally go into the land God had promised to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, over 430 years ago to Abraham. And here come the tribes, and the tribe is Reuben, and the tribe is Gad, and we will see in a few minutes half the tribe of Manasseh. So 2.5 of the 12 tribes were cattle ranchers. And getting ready and queuing up to go into the land of promise, they make a plan together, and they say to Moses, there couldn't be any other land more wonderful for grazing cattle. They mention the cities there in verse 3 that we didn't read. But all of those cities are on the eastern side of the Jordan, from the south all the way to Gilead in the north, a rich farming land we know today as the Golan Heights, which is still being farmed, much of it by the Jews. I want you to draw your attention to verse 1 and the words, and when they saw the land. And I want you to take notice of the fact that this plan was put into place when their eyes were drawn to the land, which indeed was bountiful and beautiful and wonderful for grazing land. It's kind of, I almost think like, I don't know if you ever watch like something on television and you're pretty happy with life until you see that you don't have something they're advertising. And all of a sudden you feel terrible. I got to have me one of them shiny things. I can't believe I've gone this long without it. And somehow the sales pitch can get you like disappointed, right? If I just had me one of them. It kind of reminded me reading this of what happened to Eve. The Lord gave them one commandment. You can have everything you want. Just stay away from this one tree. Just one tree. But there was choice involved. And then you go to chapter 3, verse 6 of Genesis. It says, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that was pleasant to the eyes, and that the tree could be desirable to make one wise. Well, actually, she was told that by a liar. She took of the fruit and ate and gave it to her husband, who also ate. Or Lot, when he was having such trouble with Abram's servants and all, and Abram said, well, just go one direction, I'll go in the other. We're family. We can't be bickering like this. Let's just go serve the Lord wherever he put us. Isn't the land large enough for both of us, I think is what Abram said. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. And it says, Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw the plains of Jordan. He went, well, that's what I want. It's beautiful. It's well watered. It looks like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt going down towards the south. I want that. And he chose the plains of Jordan, and he traveled to the east, and Abraham stayed in the land of Canaan, and Lot began to move his tent towards the city of Sodom. But in every one of those instances, both in terms of Lot and of Eve, and here of 2.5 of the 12 tribes who had spent years in the wilderness trying to learn a lesson and had recently been able to watch God begin to work, there is the same issue of what you see driving your heart. When John was an old apostle, he wrote in 1 John, everything that is in the world, and then there's a comma, and it says, the lust of your flesh, and the lust of your eyes, and the pride of life. It isn't from the Father, it's from the world. And there's something wrong with, or there's something to be careful of, when what you see somehow drives you forward more than what God would want for you. And it happened to these 2.5 tribes. What they saw, what they were looking at was true. There's no doubt about it. Everyone that saw it would have said the exact same thing. But it fell short of God's promises. God had better things in mind. They weren't willing to agree with that. They were willing to say, we know what we want. This is what we want. This is the best that we could ever have. And so, not wanting to completely follow the Lord, they decided because it was bountiful, it must have been bestowed. And it wasn't. It wasn't God's will at this point to give them that land. Oh, they'd get it later. That was his plan. But it wasn't to be done now on their own choosing. What they saw, God did not want them to have. He had a better place in the land for them, a much better place. And had they all went in and pressed in together and really made that their goal, we're going to be where God wants us, I suspect they could have expanded much further than they ever did. But there were already 2.5 tribes quitting on the goal. The Lord is bringing us in the land of promise. He wouldn't let our parents go in. Moses failed him. He won't let Moses go in. You can go in. And they go, yeah, we don't want to go in. We found other stuff that is far better for us than anything that God might have up our sleeve for us. One in the hand, 2 in the bush. I want what I can see. I don't want to wait by faith on what God might have for us. And interestingly enough, in the place that they saw great grazing land for the cows would become pig farms by the time Jesus showed up. It wouldn't be a place of honor at all. Well, as you would suspect, Moses hearing this freaks out because this is what he dealt with 40 years ago. This is what caused his little gray hair that he had left to fall out, right? So we read Moses said to the children of Gad and to the children of Reuben, shall your brethren go to war while you sit here? Why will you discourage the heart of the children of Israel from going into the land which the Lord has given them? That's what your fathers did when I sent them away from Kadesh Barnea to see the land. For when they went through the valley of Eshcol, they saw the land, but they discouraged the hearts of the children of Israel so that they did not go into the land which the Lord had given them. So the Lord's anger was aroused on that day. He swore in an oath. He said, surely none of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and above shall see the land, which I have sworn to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, because they have not wholly followed me, except for Caleb, the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, and of Joshua the son of Nun. They have wholly followed the Lord. And so the Lord's anger was aroused against Israel. He made them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all the generation that had done this evil in the sight of the Lord were gone. And look, you have now risen up in your father's place, a brood of sinful men, to increase still more the fierce anger of the Lord against Israel. For if you turn away from following him, he will once again leave them in the wilderness, and you will destroy all of these people. Now, you understand that, don't you? That Moses would take this request with such great concern. And he mentions to them that the last time they had come so close to the land, they had been right on the border when 10 of the 12 spies brought back that wicked report, and fear and unbelief led to 40 years of going nowhere as they waited for everyone to die. Don't ever think that your life has no influence. 10 guys turned 2.5 million people around. Look at the disaster these 10 wicked spies caused. If we go by the numbers early on, there were at least 600,000 men who are over 20 years old, plus women, not children, obviously. But it could easily have been half of that population, or 1.2 or more million people died because 10 guys went, yeah, they're big they're big giants in the land, and oh man, I don't think God's quite up to it, And a whole generation wastes their life. So Moses' words to these men are pretty harsh, but he just says, we've gone through this before. And now you're doing what your fathers did, and you're going to be the destructive force for this generation. You're going to be the cause of the death of all of these people. In fact, verse 15, you will destroy all of these people. Moses was alarmed. He was worried that the people would be discouraged. He was worried that God would have to pour out his wrath again, as he says there in verse 7. Why are you being like your fathers? It was like opening old wounds for Moses in his heart. And he challenges them. He says in verse 6 to them, so we should go to war and you could just sit over here? That's what you want? I think there is a tendency, especially when it comes to walking by faith, to want to sit while others serve. Like if you can just let other people do it, praise the Lord. I want to be blessed, but I don't necessarily want to do anything. I'll tell you what you should do. I'll criticize the way you've done it even. But don't make me get up out of the pew. And Moses begins in challenging these men with this whole issue of sitting and watching God's best for our lives go by. Ask yourself this. What do you do here at church besides sit? Where do you serve? And if you're not serving anywhere, is it because God hasn't shown you where to serve? Or you just like sitting, getting fat in the spirit? Feed me, feed me. Or is it just a matter of needing to be encouraged? Do you come to pray? Do you serve the kids? Do you go out to the convalescent home? Do you visit the folks in prison? No, I tithe so that you can do the work. Then keep your money and go to work and go serve God, because that's really what he's looking for, isn't he? It's just a matter of stepping out. And I'll tell you what, to serve the Lord, at least here, to find God's best means crossing a river, walking yourself into a land filled with enemies of God that were stronger than you and more capable of fighting, whose cities were well protected. You had faith and belief, and that's it. You're outnumbered otherwise. You look like you were outclassed in every way, but you're going to occupy the land God has given you. Joshua will be told this. Joshua, go possess your possessions. It belongs to you. Every place you put your feet, that belongs to you. But you got to get moving, man, because you'll never possess your possessions sitting over a nice grazing land with Gad and Reuben and half the tribe of Manasseh. That's not going to get it done. There is something about us needing to move out in faith. It's not the easiest place to live, but it's the only place you're going to find God's best. It's always going to be a battle. There's always going to be hardships. You're always going to have to kind of set yourself aside. But to serve the Lord is where it's at. And Moses says to these guys, so we'll go and do the work of God, and you'll just sit here and enjoy the land. Moses said in verse 9 to them, you are going to be a discouragement to the people. You're going to be a discouragement. So I'm amazed always when I hear from people in ministry that when they complain, it is usually that there's not enough laborers, that the work is being done by a few percentages, numbers-wise, and a lot of people benefit. But that's not the way a body works. Everybody does their part. In Numbers 13, when the people were discouraged, they were discouraged. Go back and read it because of the whiners, right? In Numbers 21, it wasn't the whiners, it was the way that they had to go through. It was difficult, and they began to be discouraged again. Here it is the waning of the people. They've lost their zeal. They've lost their hope. They've experienced the goodness of God, but already they're retracting. It's kind of like, well, this is enough for us. This is as far as I want to go. This is as much as I need to do. We fought enough battles, and we're going to sit back now and raise cattle. But I'll tell you what, and especially you older saints, your example has a huge effect on younger saints. And if you lose your fire, theirs will not be for long. Fear is contagious. Lethargy is contagious. But so is faith and hope. And here Moses says, so 2.5 tribes out of 12, that's a pretty big percentage, right? Over 20% of the people. He said, you're going to mess everybody up. You're going to trip them up in the decisions you're making. Now, from a spiritual standpoint, this is a pretty interesting picture because these two tribes here, plus the half that will come, were willing to settle down and take their inheritance outside the land of promise. Outside the land of promise. The Lord hadn't taken them in. He didn't say while they were sitting over there, you're in the land of promise. He said, no, you're going into it. So they decided, well, we can take it outside. Here's the picture spiritually. These are believers, if you will, satisfied with their spiritual development and progress and have no desire to move ahead. They don't want any new challenges. They don't want to gain any new ground. They want to take steps of faith. I've come as far as I need to, as much as I like. This is as comfortable as I can be. Don't make me move. This is perfect for me. God, don't ask me to do anything else. It fits our needs. It couldn't be better than this. Really? It could be a lot better than this. How do you know? Because the Lord doesn't want you there. This wasn't the land God was bringing them to. This was the border town. It was outside the border. And here's the problem. They'd already decided that what they saw was better than God's best, which they hadn't seen. Only his promises. I really think that God would have us press on in faith in our spiritual life so that we fully come to inherit what he has promised. If he wants you to have peace and you don't have it, press on. If you're not being fruitful, then get somewhere and start working and laboring because God wants to be fruitful in your life. You don't want to settle for less, right? You don't want to settle. Many of these, like these folks, they grew for a time, and you see it in church. People hit a plateau in a couple of years, and then they're on cruise control for 20 years. They sit in the same place. They talk to the same people. They show up at the same service. They don't do a thing, but they're there, just on cruise. Oh, I can't wait just waiting for Jesus to come. And you don't know if they're dead or alive even where they're sitting because they're just in the same spot all the time. If you said to them, tell me something that the Lord has been doing, they couldn't begin to articulate to you a place they've grown or some forward progress or a victory that they've made or how they've inhabited more of the land of promise. In the world, I tell you what, everything in the world is uphill. If you sit still, you're going backwards because it's all challenging. So it's like that. You stop, you're going right back down to the bottom. And that's what, unfortunately, Moses is dealing with here in a group of people that he wants in the worst way to hand off and get them into the land because that's been the last third of his life, trying to keep these people together out in the middle of nowhere. Paul wrote 30 years after he was saved to the Philippians, not that I have already attained, nor am already perfected, but I press on, that I might lay hold of that for which Christ Jesus has laid hold upon me. And then he said, brethren, I don't count myself as having apprehended, but this one thing I do, I want to forget the things that are behind. And I want to press forward and reach forward to those things which are ahead and the goal of the prize of the upward call of Jesus Christ. Paul, 30 years later, had great zeal. Now, I don't know how far you've come along in your walk with God or your service to the Lord, but I know that what hasn't happened in your life is what you want to find. And God has it available, not just for some, but for all of us. He has more than we are willing to receive. Paul kept pushing ahead. Do you find yourself pushing on in the faith to fully experience the things of the Lord? Are you settled in and losing ground and sitting back and you haven't made progress in years? That's the danger. Look, there was a whole land that still needed to be conquered. There was a whole land that represented, what did it represent? Heaven? No. It represented a life lived with God by his Spirit, right? A Spirit-filled life where you fight battles and you encounter enemies and you walk by faith. That's the land. That's Canaan, right? It's not heaven. Heaven doesn't have any enemies in it whatsoever. But all of this land that still could be taken over, all of the blessings that God had available for his people, these folks were willing to miss. Just leave us here. This is good enough. And I would say to you as a Christian, if you can say of your spiritual life, this is good enough, you're in big trouble. Because there's much more to go. There's much more to do. In your life, in my life, in our lives. Later on, when the enemies began to attack Israel, and they came from all sides, But when they came from the east or from the north or from the southeast, guess who the first tribes were to be destroyed? These guys, these fringe dwellers, these folks who settled for less. They were sitting ducks. Every time enemies came in, they were wiped out. They lost people, children and mothers and dads, murdered in battle because they didn't choose to sit where God wanted them. They chose to sit where they saw it as being good enough. It's not good enough. It's not. At the time of Jesus, the Gadarenes, like I said, were pig farmers, and you found demon-possessed men. They wanted Jesus to leave. Don't stay here, just go away. And I think about how dangerous it is to settle for spiritual mediocrity far below God's best, settling for far less. Don't do that. Go into the land. Yeah, it's hard, but go anyway. If you're still attending church and Bible studies, are you still reading and praying? Are you still sharing your faith? Are you still challenging yourself to rest in God's promises to overcome fear? Are you still learning to put God ahead of material pursuits and temporary pleasures? Are you still looking to enter into the land and take more of it by faith? Or are you just settling for less? That's the danger. Obadiah would write, "On Mount Zion you will find deliverance and holiness. The house of Jacob will possess their possessions." If you're stepping out in the ministry and taking leaps of faith, praying God will use your life, that's where the glory begins and the joy starts. Or you can just live home safely and sit in your pew and wait. Oh, come Lord. I can't sit here much longer. Well, I think they, at least in part, took it to heart. They came near to Moses in verse 16, and they said, well, how about if we build sheepfolds here for our livestock, build some cities for our little ones, but we ourselves will be armed and ready to go before the children of Israel until we have brought them to their place, and our little ones will dwell in the fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. And we will not return to our homes until every one of the children of Israel has received his inheritance. We will not inherit with them on the other side of the Jordan and beyond, because our inheritance has fallen to us on this eastern side of the Jordan. It has not fallen to them, they have chosen it. Moses said to them, if you do this thing, if you arm yourself before the Lord for war, if all of your armed men cross over the Jordan before the Lord until he has driven out his enemies from before him, if the land is subdued before the Lord, then afterward you may return and be blameless before the Lord in Israel, and this land shall be your possession before the Lord. But if you do not do so, then you take note, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. So they strike a deal. How about we build a place for our animals, build some cities to keep our women and children safe, but we'll go to fight, and afterwards we'll come back to this place, and we'll call it our inheritance. And Moses said, fine. Because he's watching, he doesn't want the people to be turned around, right? You had better believe God will deal with your wicked words if you turn away. So Moses warns them that they have a responsibility to help, and if they don't do it, he said their sin would find them out. What was their sin? Their sin would have been doing nothing or not helping. Their sin would ultimately be sitting by. Good luck, you guys. We found our hangout. I hope you find yours. Moses warns them that they have a responsibility to help. The sin was doing nothing. Usually when we talk about sin, we talk about wrongdoing, right? And we immediately think, oh, that's sin and this is sin. But there can be a sin of just doing nothing. And in God's sight, sin. I think James says, to him who knows to do good and does it not, to him it is sin. So what are you doing for the Lord? Where has God got you? And if the answer is nothing, it's not good enough to be a hearer only. And this principle of your sin finding you out, you find it throughout the scriptures. Moses knew it from personal experience. Years earlier, many years earlier, 80 years earlier, Moses had tried to kill an Egyptian in a fight and then hoped to hide it. That lasted for 24 hours before his sin found him out. Solomon would write in Proverbs, the way of a man are always before the eyes of the Lord who ponders all of his paths. Paul writes to the Hebrews, there's no creature hidden from his sight, naked and open before the Lord. Secret sin on earth, by the way, is open scandal in heaven. Remember that. Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, Jesus said to the disciples. which is hypocrisy. There's nothing covered that will not be revealed. There's nothing hidden that won't be brought to light. Whatever you speak in the dark will be heard in the light. Whatever you speak in the ear in inner rooms will be proclaimed on the housetops. Or literally, God knows, and he's going to flush you out. I remember reading somewhere, there is no real secret sin. It's a delusion. It does not exist because God knows. The truth is, whatever you sow, you reap. And sin at harvest time brings its own reward. Now, here's the sin that Moses is setting before these folks, that they are willing to settle for less, right? And you're going to be exposed. They would have been blessed in the land, mind you. They would have been moved only by what they saw and thought they needed. That's going to be the problem. Had they believed God had better plans, they would have went, man, this is great. I can't imagine what the land's going to look like. That would have been better, because God said, I'm going to take you to a good land. You talk to people sometimes about heaven, and you go, I don't know about heaven. There's no mountains, there's no ocean, there's no surfing, no snow skiing, as far as I can tell. How much better could it really be? Well, the Lord is there, for one thing, and you'll be seeing him face to face, and you're going to be there for all eternity, and the Lord said it's better. Well, I don't get it. Yeah, you don't have to get it. You just have to go there. You don't want to not go there. That's not better. That's far worse. Verse 24, so go and build cities for your little ones, folds for your sheep, and do what has proceeded out of your mouth. And the children of Gad and the children of Reuben said, your servants will do as the Lord commands. Our little ones, our wives, and our flocks, and all of our livestock will be there in the cities of Gilead. Now, Gilead today is on the eastern side of the Golan Heights. It is still there. It's still called Gilead. And they are farming lands that are mostly owned and run by the Jordanians. So they aren't even in Israel's possession right now. But your servants will cross over, everyone armed for the war before the Lord to battle. Look, the Lord is going to get rid of his enemies, but look, you're going to have to come and show up and be used by him. Isn't that something? So Moses gave commandments concerning them to Eleazar and to Joshua, to the chief fathers of the tribes of the children of Israel. And they said, if the children of Gad and the children of Reuben will cross over the Jordan with you, every man armed for battle before the Lord, and the land is subdued, and then you shall give them the land of Gilead as possession. But if they don't cross over armed with you, they shall have possession among you in the land of Canaan. And the children of Gad and the children of Reuben said, as the Lord has said to your servants, so we will do. We'll cross over, armed before the Lord, into the land of Canaan, but the possession of our inheritance shall remain with us on this side of the Jordan. And so Moses gave to the children of Gad, to the children of Reuben, and here we have the third group, to the half the tribe of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, the kingdom of Sihon, the Amorite, the kingdom of Og, the king of Bashan, the land with its cities, its borders, and the cities surrounding the country. So, have it your way. Well, from verse 34 down through verse 42, then we are given the cities that they built. I won't read them because it'll just be hard word, hard word, hard word. One final reason not to go here, besides what we've mentioned to you, and I'll just mention it to you in passing, and you can go read Joshua chapter 22 tonight in terms of this chapter. But when these 2.5 tribes head for what they claim to be their inheritance and home, on the way home, out of the conquest of Canaan, they came to the Jordan River and they built an altar. But what was heard in Israel was they started worshiping other gods. They were so far removed from the general population of the saints, of the believers, that there was immediately this great distrust between the two. And so while the 2.5 tribes went home to build an altar to the Lord to say, thank you for bringing us home, word in Jerusalem and other places where they're worshiping other gods. And so Israel formed a huge army to come wipe them out. And it wasn't until they, at the last moment, had explained to them what they were doing that they barely escaped with their own neck. But the distance from their brethren, because they were where they shouldn't be, led to bad communication, lots of assumption, near destruction. It's better you stay where God is, than out there trying to make it on your own. But anyway, that's in Joshua 22, I think. But it'll take you right back to this chapter. Chapter 33, well, these are the journeys of the children of Israel who went out of the land of Egypt by their armies under the hand of both Moses and Aaron. And Moses wrote down the starting points of their journey at the command of the Lord. So the Lord had them keep a journal. And these are the journeys according to their starting point. They departed from Ramses in the first month of the 15th day of the first, in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the day after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with boldness in the sight of all the Egyptians, for the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had killed among them. Also on their gods the Lord had executed judgment. And then children of Israel moved from Ramses, and they camped at Sukkoth, and on it goes. So Moses keeps a journal of their travels at the direction of the Lord from the time that they came out of Egypt. Now, I'm not going to take you through these verses either. Hard word. Some of the towns are absolutely unfamiliar to us. They are mentioned once, and then they are never brought up again. There are 56 towns listed in this chapter. There are 42 campsites listed, all of them leading here to the plains of Moab outside Jericho. It is a good chapter to keep things in order for yourself, to refer to when you're studying these books that we've pretty much gone through in the scriptures. I use them a lot to keep them in order as far as travel. 18 of the camping sites, we have no idea where they are to this day. And God leaves off 38 and a half years of wandering, doesn't make mention of them in here at all. So there's campsite, then absolutely nothing for 38 and a half years. 40 years minus the 11 months that they spent, plus the extra time of travel. 6 weeks to get there, 11 months to be there, a couple more, months to hear Deuteronomy. But 38 and a half years, not mentioned. It's just like a blank page, right? It just kind of stops. Not one town, not one place is mentioned in the journal for 38 and a half years. Now that's bad in the sense that when you walk away from the Lord and you want to do it on your own, that's how your life becomes. It just kind of, what have you accomplished? Yeah, absolutely nothing. What's good is, when God's grace is met, then he washes away all of those years of foolishness, right? And Micah says he will have compassion on us. He will subdue our iniquities. He will cast our sins into the depths of the sea. So from that standpoint, this chapter, which records 40 years of wandering, it leaves out the failure. Verse 1 through 4, coming out of Egypt. Verses 5 through 8, moving beyond the Red Sea. Verse 9 through 15, going from Marah, that first place where they stopped, where there was the bitter water, to Mount Sinai. From verse 16 through verse 36 is from Sinai all the way to Kadesh Barnea. And that's where the trouble was in verse 36, right? They didn't go in. So verse 37 through verse 49 picks up with the people, the second generation, in the same place, Kadesh, but it is 40 years later to the second time they come to the Jordan where they now sit. So this is the record that God kept of their travels. A couple of interesting things. Verse 4, the Lord speaks about the judgment on the Egyptians, but notice he also speaks about the judgment upon their gods, right? That he judged their gods. He dealt with their gods. He executed judgment upon the gods of the Egyptians. So when you go back and read, and we looked at it pretty carefully, they worshiped the Nile, they worshiped flies, they worshiped frogs, and God went after their gods. The river gets turned to blood, multiplies frogs, multiplies flies, just so the Lord can go, yeah, that's your God, look what I can do to your gods. Right? He put them in the microscope, if you will. Verse 38 of chapter 33, then Aaron the priest went up to Mount Or at the command of the Lord, and he died there in the 40th year after the children of Israel had come out of Egypt, on the first day of the 5th month. He was 123 years old when he died at Mount Or. 38th year of wilderness wandering, 123 years old. His sister and his brother Moses will die in that same year. And then down to verse 51, see how quickly he did that? Or verse 50, now the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, just so you know they're still in the same place. Speak to the children of Israel, say to them, when you have crossed the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall drive out all of the inhabitants of the land from before you. You shall destroy all of their engraved stones, all of their molded images, all of their high places. You shall dispossess or take from them the inhabitants of the land and dwell in it, for I have given you the land to possess. You shall divide the land by lot as an inheritance among your families. To the larger you will give a larger inheritance, to the smaller a smaller one. and everyone's inheritance shall be whatever falls to him by lot. You shall inherit according to the tribes of your fathers. But if you do not or will not drive out the inhabitants of the land, then it shall be that those whom you let remain will become irritants in your eyes, thorns in your sides. They shall harass you in the land where you dwell. Moreover, it shall be that I will do to you as I thought to do to them. Pretty powerful word. So go in, get rid of the folks who are, dispossess them of the land. These folks, judgment has come. Get rid of their objects of worship, their places of worship. Don't leave a trace of them behind. Destroy any vestige of them having ever been there. And then he says this, or you're going to find yourself destroyed by them. One way or another, influence works. You either influence folks or they influence you. And the Lord literally says to them, and will a lot in the months to come, you can't expose yourself to idolatry and sexual perversion without having it have an effect upon your life. So guard yourself. Sin has a polluting effect, right? It's kind of like exposure to radiation. You don't see the immediate results, but you will. Unfortunately, you know the story. Israel would fail to obey the Lord. They would have great problems down the road. They would only last less than 500 years before really the judgment of God would begin to fall upon those in the south particularly. And I want you to notice that this is the description of what would take place. The people in the land would become irritant in your eyes and thorns in your side and bring the judgment of God. So not only are you harassed by the people, but then you're judged by the Lord. It's kind of a double whammy. You are turned and then overcome, and then God deals with you as well. Chapter 34, and again, many hard words, so we're going to be good. Lays out for us the boundaries of Israel's inheritance. You should get a good map out if you read it carefully to get a picture of the boundaries. The Mediterranean to the west, the Jordan River to the east. God gives them in verse 3 their southern border. He gives them their western border in verse 6, their northern border in verse 7, their eastern border in verse 10. I want you to know that those borders included not only the land that the 2.5 tribes wanted, but far, far more. It wasn't that God wouldn't have given them those things down the road. Their mistake was trying to get it before God wanted them to have it, and settling for something that God hadn't said at the time. God had far more in mind. Well, beginning in verse 16 and heading down to verse 29, which I think is the end of the chapter, is a list of names of those chosen by God who would be used to help distribute the land to the various tribes. There was one prince from each tribe. So verse 16, the Lord speaks to Moses, and he said, these are the names of the men who shall divide the land among you as an inheritance. There will be Eleazar, he's the high priest, Aaron's son. There will be Joshua the son of Nun. You shall take one leader of every tribe to divide the land for the inheritance. These are the names of the men. From the tribe of Judah, you should take Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. From the tribe of the children of Simeon, you should take Shemuel. And you can continue down that road on your own. But you see, Moses is preparing to leave these things in their capable hands. So God is giving them final information. And I read this and I think to myself, I wonder how heartbroken Moses was. This is what you do when you get there. I won't be going with you. You know, he had a little hiccup in 80 years of faithful service. But I never find him complaining or questioning God's judgment in any place in the Scriptures. Whatever happened to him, he was willing to let God be God. Let me conclude tonight with an important statistic. God gave to Abraham a promise of land that, if you go look at it at a map, was the equivalent of about 300,000 square miles. That's what God promised Abraham. When he laid out for him the land, it was 300,000 square miles. When David came to power, certainly the most powerful king in Israel, and when his son Solomon took over a kingdom that was as large and as powerful as it would ever be to this day. It was at its apex, at its zenith, if you will. They occupied less than 30,000 square miles. So even at their best, they ended up with about a tenth of what God intended, a tenth of what God promised. I suspect that they will get all 100%. In fact, I know they will when the Lord returns. I think Israel will rule from that position then. But I don't think there's any Bible verse that would convince you that they weren't supposed to have it the first time. Because the Lord said very clearly, this is going to be yours. And even at that point, they only enjoyed a tenth of God's promises. So you go back to that Joshua chapter 1, verse 3 verse, and it says, every place you put your foot is yours. And I would say to you, don't come up short. Go walk where God says to walk. Take what God has provided. Don't let it slip you by. If he says, pray, and then pray until you're answered. Seek God, lay down your life, deny yourself, pick up your cross. Don't come up short. Because these folks did. And even here we read about all of the preparation. And you guys have been very faithful to come every week and plug through them. It's not always easy. But you get a pretty good picture of what was happening on the border when 20% of the people were bailing out 40 years after 100% of the people literally had failed to go in. So God help us that we wouldn't come up short. I think that there are more Christians than not living subpar Christian lives, not in terms of morality, but in terms of experiencing God's best. I think we end up far less than God has for us. That's a problem. You want more, don't you, of God's hand? We were talking with the pastors this morning about that. Moses, who probably could have made an argument that he'd seen more than most people that were alive, right? I mean, from his 40 years in the wilderness to his 40 years with the children of Israel, beginning with the plagues, to all of the provisions God made. And at some point in the midst of all of that, God speaks to him face to face. Nobody talks to God like Moses. His face glows when he hangs out with God. He can't hide the fact he's been in his presence. And then he says, this is the Lord, I just want to see your glory. The guy wasn't satisfied. And the Lord said, well, you see my glory, you die, but I'll show you where I've been. I'll show you the afterglow, right? Isn't that where we get that word from? I'll put my hand over your face, I'll come by, and when I'm by, I'll pull it back, and you'll see the streak, you'll see the nova, I don't know, you'll see the light, you'll see the sparkling, you'll see where I've been. And Moses, all right, if that's all I get. But he wanted more. I read that the first time, I thought, Moses, you're so selfish. I wish I could just have what you had. Moses goes, yeah, well, when you get what I want, you'll want more. I think we should want more. I think you should never be satisfied as a Christian. Don't be satisfied. God wants you to have more in your life, not just in terms of getting, but in terms of being useful to him. If you're willing, just go put your feet down somewhere. Or, here's your other choice. You can just sit there until Jesus comes. Your choice. Father, thank you tonight as we sit together that you are a faithful God who has far more plans for us than we are willing to admit. And Father, may we learn from these tribes tonight as we read the history of these people as they are getting ready to mount an attack on the land that you've given them, that there was at least 20% of them who were willing to be settling for less, who had to be told that they were going to be a discouragement to the others, that they were acting much like their fathers who had gone the generation before and brought the deaths of millions, that they weren't in line with the will of God. They were given what they asked for. But Lord, to this day, it does seem in your scriptures that your will was for them to go in and to protect their people. How much did their children who left at home not learn of your goodness? How much did their wives and girlfriends and daughters not learn of the glory of the God of Israel because they didn't go into battle? They didn't walk with the people. They just sat across the river waiting and waiting some more. 7.5 years of waiting and missing out. May we not just settle for less. May you stir our hearts. And if we don't think we have anything to offer, may you show us that you've got plenty to do. And if we don't think we're qualified, Lord, as good of a thought as that is, that doesn't disqualify us from being available. And may we push ahead and put our foot down. And may we lay claim to this city and this country once again. God, you can do great things if the church would just rise up and call you blessed. Stir our hearts tonight. Push us forward. Show us, Lord, what we need to do so that our life doesn't just go by, lived in the world, successful in many things, so short-handed in spiritual gain. But push us ahead, we pray. And as Moses gets ready to depart for glory, May we hear his words, that we should spend our life well, and we should possess the land you've promised to us. Shall we stand?